Everyone else in the plaza moved like a single bright current. Cameras up, voices high, a dozen languages folding into the same summer noise. Stalls steamed with frying oil and sugar. An accordion wheezed a two-chord tune under a canopy of umbrellas. People posed on the low stone wall, feet dangling like ornaments, laughing at themselves. The day looked exactly like a day meant to be remembered. On the curb beneath that gleam, tucked against the base of a tourist information kiosk, sat a dog who did not ask to be seen. He was the color of something ordinary, a soft, unremarkable brown that slid into the pavement like a shadow. His fur had the dull sheen of someone who'd been on the road for a while. Neither matted nor glossy enough to catch a quick eye. Not small enough to be a novelty, not striking enough to be a rescue poster. He could have been a bench cushion, a leaf, an afterthought. People stepped around him as if he belonged to the theatrical props of the square. A man in a wide-brimmed hat set his coffee down 2 feet away, moved his hand over the dog's head without touching, and took a picture of his own thumb with the dog in the blurry background. A couple in matching linen shirts smiled at their phones and walked by like they were in a slideshow. A child reached out, then was hushed by a parent who mistook the dog's thinness for something else. A stray? A neighborhood fixture? And shrugged the way people shrug at weather. No one paused to name him. No one knelt. Their faces skimmed past the dog's eyes and kept going. The woman noticed him because her body halts at things others miss. It was not a practiced saintliness, more like a habit she'd accumulated from small habitual refusals to look away. She had a cap pulled low against the sun, a backpack that had flattened under her calm, and a pair of shoes that could have been described as sensible. Her day was supposed to be the same as everyone's. A few errands, a cafe, a bus back. She was technically a passerby. She saw the dog because, for a moment, something in the crowd thinned and the dog had room to be visible. Their eyes met, and the noise contracted into a kind of private film strip. The dog's amber gaze, shaded and careful. The black rim of his pupils, bright with a kind of polite calculation. The tiny hesitation as if he was trying to remember what it felt like to trust a hand. She felt the world fold small, as if the square had only 2 bodies in it now. One soft brown shape on the curb, and one human who had the option of walking away. Time provided her with a sliver, the length of a breath, to choose. She could have walked on. There are ways to scaffold indifference into a life that feels safe. We tell ourselves that someone else will call, that a shelter will notice, that the dog might already have a person somewhere. Those refrains are useful. They keep us from drowning in everything the city throws at us. She knew them. She had rehearsed them in the past. They came like a chorus from the crowd. It's not yours, it's just a street dog. Someone else will do it. Something else answered instead. It might have been the faint memory of a childhood dog that had once accepted her on a rainy afternoon. It might have been a string of small mercies she kept for dark days. It might have been a practical calculus. She could, in 5 minutes, buy some food and possibly coax him up. The reason mattered less than the motion. She took off her backpack. The dog watched with the wary politeness of someone who had been offered handshakes that led to roads. He lifted a paw a fraction, then set it down. The woman moved like a low tide coming up. Slow, deliberate, no sudden reach. She bought a sandwich from a vendor who wrapped it in wax paper without looking at the dog and a bottle of water with a receipt that fluttered into a gutter. She sat on the curb 3 feet from him and unfolded the paper, left the sandwich half open. The first act of rescue is rarely grand. It is often a quiet betrayal of the city's speed. She did the kind of small, visible things that attract animals. In her town, they called it being patient enough to be boring. She made space, and the dog assessed that space the way a scientist weighs variables. After a long minute that felt like an hour, he edged closer, nose first, then chest, then the gentle abrasion of whiskers against wax paper as he took the crust. His ribs showed the careful discipline of hunger, but he ate with the cautious gratitude of one who had learned that food can vanish without warning. He drank, a careful sip that kept the last oil from the bottle's neck on his tongue. The woman watched every micro-expression as if she were cataloging a delicate ledger. The lift of his snout when he caught a scent he liked. The way his tail tucked low and trembled when a stroller rolled past too fast. Her eyes were trained to read what the dog did not say. She looked at his paws, inked with dirt, at the small scar along his right ear like a comma, at the way his jaw clicked once when he swallowed, a tiny, telling signal of old nervousness. She did not imagine a heroism. She catalogued, she planned, she called a friend. Her friend answered after 3 rings. She always answered unless she was in a shelter, or driving, or asleep. This time she picked up in a voice that carried the faint strain of someone who spent their life on other people's emergencies. On the other end, the friend listened and said the words volunteers say when shelters are overwhelmed. "We can try, but it's tight today. Numbers are up. I'll call around." The woman tucked the sandwich into the dog's fur for a moment, as if to anchor him with warmth. The plaza hummed around them. A tourist in neon sneakers posed directly behind them and took a selfie, smiling into a lens while the dog's head rose, briefly puzzled by the sudden flash. The woman felt a swell of ironic displeasure. Modern compassion, it seemed, often meant photographing the problem from a distance. "People are weird," she said aloud, half to the dog, half to herself. The wryness slid into the air like a cushion. He cocked his head once. The sound of the plaza filled the gap again, but now it had a softer chorus. Someone humming a busker's tune, shoes scuffing, a child asking for cotton candy. If this is the kind of thing that catches at you, small, stubborn mercy, then consider sticking around. There are more people like her than you think, and not all of them are saints. Some of them are just inconveniently persistent. She hung up and scanned options. The nearest municipal shelter had a voicemail announcing capacity limits. A private rescue had a 3-hour intake window and a wait list. The clinic several blocks over could do a triage, but they charged up front. She had a few dollars and a phone that liked to die early. Logistics are cruel that way. Love is cheap, but transport and treatment are not. She understood those constraints intimately. They were, in a small way, part of her vocabulary. She had coaxed birds from drains and patched up the odd injured paw with strips of a first aid kit she carried for people more than for pets. She kept a list of volunteer numbers in a note on her phone. She also kept the stubborn habit of finding workarounds before she explained herself to anyone. "Okay," she told the dog, and then the world, and herself. "We make a plan." The plan began with the vendor. He was a man with a face like melted caramel, quick to smile and quicker to assume that the city's small tragedies were someone's long-running sitcom. He remembered the dog vaguely. "Been around," he said. "Neighborhood pet, maybe. Folks feed him. He likes the red bench." "Has anyone tried to take him?" she asked. He shrugged. "People fuss. Then they Instagram him. He leaves." That kind of answer is both frustrating and useful. It meant no formal owner had stepped forward in recent memory, but it also meant the dog likely had a social niche that was not quite a home. It meant a line of potential owners who would show up as a chorus of hands, none decisive. She left her number with the vendor, then moved to the park officer sitting on a folding chair under a tree, clipboard on his lap, sunglasses reflecting a world that was easier to enforce than save. He fit a stereotype, a municipal uniform pressed so cleanly it looked almost symbolic. He looked at her and then at the dog as if the dog might be a checkable box on a list of minor urban annoyances. "Ma'am," he said, a shade of official weariness in his voice, "if you're reporting a stray, you have to call animal control. We can take a look, but we can't remove an animal without protocol." She explained. She told him the dog looked thin, that he had no obvious collar, that he was scared of loud noises. She did not implore. She presented evidence and a timeline. She mentioned the shelter's full voicemail. She offered a possible solution. She could keep the dog until the shelter called back. The officer hesitated the way policy makes people pause. "People keep dogs on promises," he said, soft enough to be humane and hard enough to be legal. "We get fosters who become lost to the system. We prefer intake through the shelter to limit liability." He was not unsympathetic, he was procedural. That is a reality a lot of rescuers meet. Compassion is sometimes caged by forms. She understood the old bureaucratic script. But she also watched the dog glance once at the officer and then at her as if asking which human would take simple action now. The dog's eyes said a practical thing. Someone who moves. Rules mattered. But hunger and fear didn't mail their needs to the right department. She folded the officer's concern into her next move. The first practical step was simple, securing the dog. She looked around for a leash and found nothing but 2 dangling shoelaces and a tourist's cheap scarf. Improvisation is a part of most rescues, and that day it became her instrument. She made a loop with a shoelace, threading it through itself to form a rough collar. Nothing permanent, nothing pretty. It would hold for a short journey. She knelt, hands steady, and worked under the dog's chin. He watched the movement with the patience of someone who knew the shape of human hands. When the makeshift collar fit, he flinched once but stayed. "Easy now," she murmured. She did not pat him roughly, did not try to pick him up. She let him come to her. He leaned in with the sparse courage of a creature who had learned that surrender to a hand could sometimes bring safety. The small contact was a pact. Just as a pact is being inked, a small commotion happened near the fountain. A tourist had dropped his camera and the lens skittered across the cobblestone with a metallic clatter. A shriek followed. One of the passing dogs, someone's well-groomed lapdog on a too-long leash, barked at the noise. The plain dog jerked. He bolted. He did not run away into a heroic sprint. He slipped like a wet thing between legs and under a parked scooter. The plaza closed around the gap. Feet, carts, cameras. People made a human river as the dog threaded through, and for a moment he was a brown streak of intention. The woman's body moved with the same decision that had started her to this point. She chased, not with adrenaline for theater, but with a piloted urgency that looks for the small openings. People misread the momentum of rescues. They think rescue is a neat arc of arrival, clumsy obstacle, triumph. That too happens. More often, rescuers discover that half the work is misdirection, seeing where fear hides and coaxing it out. He dove into a narrow alley between a bakery and a closed shop, a strip of shadow so thin that the late sun could only graze the ground at its mouth. The alley smelled of yeast, old paper, and the faint metallic tang of rust. It felt smaller when she squeezed in. Coat-brushing walls. She crouched, whispering his name like a prayer she hoped he could hear beyond the noise. Inside, the world shrank into details. A discarded shopping bag, a broken crate, a puddle reflecting a sliver of sky. The dog had chosen a place that smelled like shelter to him. A thing that could hide and still be near food, near people if they came looking. He rested under a metal bench, chest heaving, eyes bright in a face-clean kind of terror. The alley offered a different kind of audience. No one had pulled an umbrella to pose here. The rhythm was quieter, more intimate. The woman sat on her heels and waited. She did not reach immediately. She knew that reaching too quickly after a spooked flight could seal the chance forever. She let the city breathe around them. She unwrapped the sandwich and offered it gingerly. The dog crept forward and ate the last crust. He lifted his head and licked the woman's fingers, then retreated. "You're full of surprises," she said softly to him and the damp brick. He gave a small, shaky exhale. That exhale was a tiny proof. He had chosen to come back. Trust in his world had a price measured in tiny, returnable breaths. She texted her friend again, fingers quick. The clinic voicemail suggested urgent walk-ins could be treated, but only with payment or a reference from a rescue. Her friend texted back provisions. A number for a volunteer who had a crate and a promise she might come in an hour. The shelter was full. They suggested a list of fosters but no immediate intake. The web of goodwill had many knots, and tightening one to help a single animal often required weaving a dozen others. She considered the options. A bus to the clinic, a taxi, pleading with the officer to make an exception. But the alley showed her a more essential fact. He was here, he was near, and he had a breathing rhythm that would not wait for perfect logistics. There is a peculiar truth to all salvations. They happen in the messy middle before the schedule catches up. She pulled her coat off and made a makeshift sling. The dog did not protest. He seemed to understand in a small way that humans sometimes become temporary domiciles. He settled against her chest, fitting his head under her chin like someone tucking into a scarf. His ribs pressed against the fabric. He sighed, a long, small sound that carried the day's weight out of him. She stood and felt the immediate change in his posture. The tension that had lived in his spine during the plaza loosened inch by inch. His eyes, which had been like two wary coins, softened. He nuzzled once and then rested his muzzle on her shoulder. At that exact time, holdouts of the plaza drifted into the alley like a curious audience. An elderly woman leaned over the bakery door and watched with faint concern. A delivery cyclist slowed, one hand still on a handlebar. The park officer stood at the alley's mouth, a lowered stamp of officialdom that suggested he had followed at a distance and was assessing the situation with the bureaucrat's slow logic. If the woman intends to transport, can she legally do so? If she keeps the animal, is it now her legal responsibility? These are the small tensions rescues must live beside. Policy and need. Paperwork and breath. He asked the woman again about the possibility of formal intake. He mentioned reports and liability and dispatching animal control. None of it was unkind. It was the language of institutions. It sounded like an instruction manual for care where the manual had too few pages. "You can't just take him if someone later claims him," the officer said. "We have to log microchips and check ownership." She nodded. The dog's head moved against her shoulder, and she felt the weight there change from problem into a thing that trusted her. The officer's words did not alter that small physics. He stood for a moment and then, with a gentle shrug that suggested sympathy and the immutable boundary of his badge, he stepped back. Officers are often intermediaries between procedure and mercy. Some choose to hedge toward procedure because institutions do not respond well to improvisation. The woman called another number, an old volunteer who owed her a favor, and left a message. She worried about 1,000 little things. The dog's nails cracked along the edges from walking on rough pavement. The skin around his mouth was a little raw from chewing, signs of neglect, not violence, but neglect still compromising. He might carry parasites, or he might just be hungry. She had a small cash reserve in her wallet and a deeper reserve of belief that clinics sometimes make exceptions, that people sometimes help. A voice interrupted her thought. Not a human one, but a small, clear bark from the alley's far end. She looked. A woman stood there with a paper cup of coffee and a dog leash looped around her wrist, her expression a hesitant map of someone who had just decided to care and was short on confidence. "Is he okay?" the newcomer asked. The new arrival's presence complicated the geometry of the rescue in the way any human interest story invites characters. She made an offer. She had a crate in her car 2 blocks away. She could bring it. The woman accepted with the relief of someone who has been holding their breath and finds someone offering oxygen. Help, when it arrives, is often a matter of timing and thrift. It arrives with small disclaimers and vague guarantees. The helper walked off, back toward the sunlit street, leaving a minor promise that could collapse under the day's errands. The woman stayed with the dog, keeping him steady, keeping him warm. The cell phone buzzed again. It was a different volunteer, the kind who worked long shifts in rescue groups and had developed a voice calloused by too many pleas. "We can possibly take him, but only if you can get him to a clinic for a vet check, and we need a picture and the area where you found him. Intake is slow. If you can foster him overnight, we might have slots open tomorrow." She read the reply and felt the familiar alignment of possibilities and obstacles. Someone had promised a crate. Someone had promised a slot if the dog could reach triage. Someone else was waving a hand from 2 hours away. Rescue unfolded as a chain of small yeses and delayed maybes. Then the plaza's subtle animal dynamics threw a new variable into the equation. A man in a gust of tourist enthusiasm pointed at the alley and called out to a friend, misinterpreting the scene as a charming moment for pictures. His voice was too loud. The dog startled. He lunged. The makeshift shoelace collar slipped. In one startled breath, he bolted. This time he didn't slip into shadow. He launched toward the street. The woman's heart sank in a particular physical way. Her hands flailed for the leash. Nothing. The alley opened to a crosswalk and a line of cars idling at a red light. A bus rolled up, brakes whispering. Traffic was the kind of danger that taught animals to run where people could not follow. The plaza offered a finite number of ways out. He chose the busiest. She sprinted, coat undone and trailing, shouting his name like the city was a place that could be called back into order. The dog zigged between legs and narrow cones, a brown comet. People gasped. A mother pulled a child back. A man dropped his gelato and cursed with the sort of muffled profanity grief directs at the world when it offers small calamities instead of answers. The dog reached the road and paused mid-stride, backyarded by a bus whose driver was now looking in the mirror and honking, the kind of sound that shakes teeth. The dog crouched as if deciding whether to dart between tires or fold into a sidewalk shelter. The woman, breath burning, lunged. So much of rescue is timing and trust. He could have frozen and been trapped by a new terror. He could have darted into traffic. Instead, something tiny happened. He looked at her for an instant, eyes locking, pupils large, surrender and question blended into a single gaze. And then he chose the human who had fed him a crust and wrapped his shoulders in a coat. He cut back to the curb, not into the road. He scraped a forepaw along the cement, leaving a thin heel mark, and then he bounded in a small desperate run toward the woman who was falling to her knees with a chest full of exhausted relief. His body slapped lightly against her in a way that said, "I will take this moment, this small safety, because you offered it first." She scooped him up, a move that was equal parts instinct and calculation. The scarf that tied into a loop around his neck snagged and loosened in the scuffle, but she had him, wrapped to her chest like a dog-sized heart. She stood in the street, chest heaving, dog in arms, the city's noise swarming louder now that the small drama had resolved in his favor. Tires hissed, honking continued, but a small ring of people had gathered, all with some version of the same expression. Amusement sympathy. The look that often greets public acts of kindness. Some clapped, others filmed. Social media's applause hovered like a potential that would not do anything practical. She breathed, and the dog, at last safe from immediate danger, relaxed a little. His tongue lolled out in an ungainly way as his face softened into a forgiveness that animals give freely when fear evaporates and trust returns. The officer came forward then, his face more open. He did not arrest her for impulsive rescue. He set his hands on his hips and offered the language he had the right to offer. We can wait for animal control, but if you're set on transporting, make sure he's secure. You understood he may not legally be yours if someone claims him. Her voice was flat with fatigue and luck. I understand, she said. Inside, 1,000 practical questions ticked. Where to take him, how to fund the visit, what to do if someone did claim him. All of those questions were stopgaps against the simple fact that right now he was alive and in her arms, warm and steady. She set her phone to search for clinics in the area. The map spit out a scatter of red pins. Most were a drive time away. The nearest one was 2 blocks and had an evening sign that said they closed in an hour. The volunteer with the crate had messaged a new ETA, 20 minutes. Her friend called back to say they had a donor who could cover the exam if needed. A stranger from the ringed crowd offered cash, as if kindness could be passed like change. The small kindness, the one that had nudged the city's indifferent momentum, had summoned an ad hoc community. That part felt natural, an instinctive human response to a visible need. Yet even as help accreted like leaves in a pile, a new complication percolated. Night would not wait, and the dog's limp indicated he had not fed well in a long time. The clinic needed his weight to dose medicine correctly. The makeshift collar had to be replaced with something sturdier for transport. Her backpack had room for a crate if she could find one. She took another breath. The plaza light shifted toward gold. The day's music softened. She could page through the options, call yet another volunteer, negotiate with a clinic for triage. Or she could take him herself on public transit. She was capable, but she was also, like everyone, limited. She had a work shift the following morning, a rent to pay, a life with edges. She was not a fairy who could fit rescues into every crevice. She was a woman with a knotted courage. A new voice drew her attention. A middle-aged man approached, wearing a glossy tourist badge and a lanyard that declared nothing of real authority. He waved a paper at her with a nervous smile. "Excuse me," he said. "That is my dog." The statement fell into the alley like a small stone. The woman, who had been balancing hope and plans, felt the stone hit her ankle. The man's assertion came with the hardened tone of someone making an uncertain claim into a fact by insistence. He insisted that the dog matched a photograph on his phone. A picture of a plain brown dog in a different place. A dog who looked very much like the dog in her arms. She felt anger flicker. Not at the man, but at the systems that roomed this murk of uncertain ownership. She understood how easy it is to claim a thing seen out of context. She also understood that sometimes claims can be earnest, and sometimes they are opportunistic. She couldn't know which this was. The officer stepped forward, careful now to put procedure in motion. He asked the man for the time and place the photograph was taken. He asked for details. The man muttered, and his story folded at the edges. He had been in town for 3 days, he said. He had seen the dog earlier and had been feeding it because he was a good person. Rules were now relevant in a way they had not been an hour ago. The officer advised that they could check a microchip and run the number through animal control. That was sensible, but it required resources and time. The volunteer with the crate messaged she was 2 blocks away and could be there in 10. The woman looked down at the dog, who had his head tucked against her collarbone, wholly uninterested in the politics of possession. He smelled faintly of pizza grease and crust and the city sun. His chest rose and fell in a sleep-hacked rhythm. She thought about the man's photo. She thought of how easy it is for claims to be honest and for them to be convenient. She also thought of the dog's present body, his limp, his spine, the scar on his ear, which did not match the glossy tourist's portrait of suburban possession. Her mind was a ledger of likely and unlikely. "Let's get him a vet check," she said finally. The officer nodded. The tourist man's face hardened into something like patience and complaint. The volunteer messaged a new ETA, 5 minutes. The woman glanced toward the street where the light had begun to fade into the kind of late afternoon that suggests the city is moving toward dinner and decisions. She made a choice that felt like a balance between rules and mercy. She would take him to the clinic 2 blocks away. She would ask them to scan for a chip. She would document his state with photos and a short report. She would then contact the shelter with any documentation and hold him until a formal claim could be investigated. It was not an elimination of risk. It was an attempt to move within the structures that might stabilize the dog's future. She stood, adjusting him in her arms. He blinked, awake, and licked her chin. It was a small, homey gesture, the kind of thing that cuts through formalities with a blade of ordinary affection. It undercut the tourist man's assertion because it suggested the dog had made a decision about the human in his arms. Animals sometimes choose in ways that are not legal but are real as breath. They started down the street. The plaza's noise stitched itself back into place. People resumed their selfies. The officer watched them leave with an expression that balanced caution and a faint admiration. The tourist man followed at a distance, phone in hand, as if he might be needed to corroborate or contradict something later. The clinic door swung open to a bell that was softer than the bus's horn and more insistent than the plaza's music. Inside smelled of antiseptic and coffee. A receptionist called out a cautious greeting. The woman stepped up to the counter with a dog in her arms and a dozen small administrative realities already taking shape. "Do you have a payment method?" the receptionist asked. No, not exactly. She had enough cash for a portion, not for an unknown procedure. She did not have a rescue affiliation on file. She had a half-dozen phone numbers and a volunteer en route with a crate. "Explain the situation," the receptionist said, the cadence of someone who had heard 100 versions of this story and trusted nothing that lacked a paper trail. She did. She showed photos, messages, the vendor's number, the park officer's name. The receptionist typed quickly, not unkindly. The clinic could triage but asked for a deposit. The volunteer would have to show up and sign if a longer treatment was necessary. The tourist man arrived minutes later, panting, the sheen of someone who had exhausted his argument into disappointment, claiming between breaths that the dog belonged to another town in a photograph he had seen. The clinic suggested they scan for a microchip. That was a neutral mechanical thing, a flashlight and a beep. If the dog had been microchipped, it would be quick proof of ownership. They did the scan. The machine beeped benignly. No chip. The absence of a chip told the woman nothing definitive and everything practical. It suggested that the legal fast track to restoring the dog to his owner did not exist. It also suggested a darker truth. Many pets, especially those who end up on city streets, never had the protection of a chip. The tourist man's shoulders sagged the way everyone's shoulders sag when a simple answer falls into a tangle. He said the photograph might be from a cousin's house or a park 4 neighborhoods over. He began to look suddenly like a man who had built a case out of a half-memory and found his foundation shaky. The clinic offered a basic triage while they waited for the volunteer. They weighed the dog. He was underweight but not emaciated. They checked his temperature, it was slightly low. They looked at his ears and found that small scrap of healed tissue that suggested previous scuffles, not a recent attack. The vet's voice was careful and factual, offering words like malnourished and dehydrated without any melodrama. They recommended a blood panel that would require a bit more money. As the vet spoke, the woman sat upright with the grit that keeps people functioning in the middle of bureaucratic tangle and animal tenderness. The volunteer arrived with a crate, dented, smelling faintly of old straw. She signed a paper that made her responsibility apparent, and then inclined toward the woman with a small, grateful smile for starting the whole chain. "Do you want to foster until you hear back from animal control?" the volunteer asked. Her question was practical and offered a road that could bridge the immediate and the official. She considered. She thought of her week ahead, of rent, of responsibilities. She thought of the dog in her arms, warm and breathing slow, a body that had elected her in the plaza and now seemed to ask for a foothold. She imagined the night that would be required to bring him medicine and warmth. She thought of how such a night could be stitched into the pattern of a life with edges if she was willing to rearrange a few things. "Yes," she said finally. It was not a heroic cry. It was a decision like sliding a key into a lock. "I'll foster, for now." The paperwork followed because life prefers forms to feelings. She signed lines that made legal the temporary guardianship. The man who had claimed the dog watched, his phone in his hand like a frail authority. He said he might come back with more pictures. The clinic advised caution, suggesting a waiting period for anyone claiming ownership. It was a sensible bridge between the private acts of care and civic rules designed to weigh competing claims. They would hold the dog, treat him for parasites and malnutrition, and then post an intake report. If someone claimed him with a microchip or a verifiable paper trail, the clinic would cooperate with law. If no claim arrived, a path toward rehoming or a rescue space might be cleared. All of that was a kind of good news and bad news. The man's claim complicated nothing in the clinic's hands. The dog would be safe for the evening. The volunteer would transport him to a foster until the shelter could step in. But the stretch from that night to a settled future still required many hands and many small yeses. She sat in a vinyl chair in the clinic's waiting room while a nurse weighed out doses and a volunteer cleaned the crate. The dog, now in a soft bed, poked his head up intermittently. He licked the woman's hand like a small, solemn benediction. People in the room glanced with a soft combination of curiosity and relief. Rescue stories often land on edges like this, where the animal breathes easier, but the future is not yet signed in ink. Her phone buzzed again with messages from the donor who could cover the exam costs, and from her friend who promised to check shelter availability in the morning. The man who had claimed the dog left a number and a series of photographs that, when compared, seemed to show a similar dog in a different context. None of it proved ownership. The vet closed the folder and looked up. "We can get him on a refeeding schedule and treat his parasites, but the first night is always the hardest," she said, translating the clinical to the human. The woman nodded. The clinic staff moved with the quiet competence of those who triangulate mercy and medicine. They gave her a packet of information about fostering, about signs of distress, about food types not to give. They handed her the packet like a small survival kit. Feeding schedules, a sheet about gradual refeeding, a list of foods to avoid, signs of distress to watch for overnight, and a line about how most foster placements feel a lot longer than anyone expects. The nurse folded in a handwritten note. "Slow meals, warmth, no sudden visitors." She tucked it into her wallet with the volunteer's phone number and a receipt for the exam. The crate was dented but clean. A towel from the clinic made a soft bed inside. Night arrived like a decision. The volunteer drove them back to the woman's neighborhood in the old car with a radio that hummed like a distant conversation. The dog sat quietly in the crate the whole way, head rested on forepaws, eyes half closed but alert enough to peek when the car passed a row of lit windows. The woman's chest tightened in a new kind of responsibility. The attention of a life asking for the scaffolding of habit. At home, she set up a corner by the window with blankets and a bowl of lukewarm water. She read the refeeding sheet twice and made the first meal slow and small, the prescribed arithmetic of calories measured like trust. The dog nosed the bowl, tasted, and ate with a gentle greed that did not frighten her. He drank, then laid his head down and breathed as if measuring the silence for the shape of safety. She did not sleep well. Rescuers rarely do the first night, but it was a different sort of wakefulness. There were practical checklists in her head. Medication schedule, crate rest, whether his limp required a follow-up. There were softer lists too. A name to try, a way to call him that would not feel like a command. Names are often the first small home people give animals. They are a bridge between anonymous need and particular belonging. She tried a few. Buddy felt too sitcom. Charlie sounded like a dog from a different life. She sat on the floor and watched his chest rise and fall until a name slid out of her like a quiet decision. "Milo," she said, almost to herself. He twitched, nose lifting as if tasting the syllable, then settled like a pebble dropped into warm water. Names are not magic, but they are a kind of invitation. The next morning fell into a routine of small, hopeful actions. The clinic called with basic blood work results. Nothing catastrophic, some anemia consistent with undernourishment, and a plan for parasite treatment. The vet warned that his coat would take weeks to regain gloss and that energy would come back in increments. They set a schedule for rechecks and wrote out doses she could afford. The language remained careful. Promises were not part of the vocabulary, but the tone was constructive. Plans, after all, are the practical prayers of people who care. The man who had claimed him called again. This time he sounded less assured. He said the photographs he had were of a dog that lived elsewhere. Perhaps he had misremembered. He asked if she would consider returning him if someone proved ownership. The woman listened, her voice steady. "We'll follow the clinic's procedure," she said. The man thanked her and then, later, never called back. Small tests of trust came in the shape of everyday life. Milo startled at the sound of a microwave and flinched the first time the woman reached quickly to pick up a phone. He learned to wait at the threshold for permission before lunging at a bowl. He discovered the comfort of a soft hand and returned it like someone rediscovering a safe harbor. The neighbor who once walked by without noticing a thin brown shape now waved. bringing a towel the next day because the dog liked the fabric. The vendor from the plaza sent a text. "Blanket for Milo. On my way." Word had a curious velocity when it was coupled to compassion. Work schedules collided with care. The woman rearranged shifts and traded hours with a colleague. Her social life thinned, her attention widened. She learned to bring Milo's crate to the office for short stretches, tucking him under her desk where clients' shoes sounded less threatening. People asked questions and brought dog biscuits like small pilgrimages of support. One regular gave a wreath of ridged dog treats and a name tag he had engraved cheap and cheerful. Milo. In the shelter world, days are measured by forms and windows and the careful counting of spaces. The volunteer checked the intake lists and called shelters in nearby neighborhoods. All were full but willing to help with paperwork if Milo needed an official transfer. For now, fostering bought time, a legislated breathing space where paperwork could catch up to the flesh and bone reality of a living animal. Milo's improvements were not cinematic. They were arithmetic. 2 ounces more a week, brighter eyes, a tail that lifted a degree each morning. He enjoyed a patch of sunlight on the rug and would roll into it like someone rediscovering how to stretch. He tolerated baths with a patience bordering on nobility. Once, mid-morning, he offered the woman a half-playful nudge, a small headbutt that broke open the last of her depleting reserve, and made laughter leak out of her in an astonished sputter. Rescue stories often peak when small gestures become habits. That nudge was, for her, a kind of summit. Not everyone was eager to help. There was the man in the building below who complained about noise and offered a lecture about pets and responsibility. There were logistical hiccups. A crate strap broke during a trip to the clinic. A delivery of the wrong food arrived. Each friction carried a grain of truth. Kindness has to contend with a messy world. But each time someone stepped forward, the load lightened. The plaza vendor who had offered a blanket now left a bowl of broth every other day. The park officer sent a short message to check in and, in the way officers do, offered a small piece of paperwork that might help a future claim. Acts like these knitted a thin safety net beneath the woman and Milo. As the weeks passed, social media did what social media does. Someone from the plaza uploaded a photo of Milo and tagged the area. A small public announcement that raised a handful of supportive comments and 1 or 2 inquiries. A few offers to rehome him came in earnest. A family in the suburbs with a fenced yard. A retired teacher who wanted company. Each offer arrived with a kindness that required vetting, names, references, home checks, and the woman, now invested, felt the weight of choosing well. She did not want to replace one precarious situation with another. The clinic called in a month with encouraging news. Milo had gained weight steadily. His blood levels were improving. The vet recommended continuing the refeeding plan and beginning a gentle exercise routine to strengthen muscle. He was not a miraculously altered creature. He remained cautious in certain situations and would always carry the soft scars of past neglect. But he was alive and improving in ways measurable and true. A legal hold period elapsed with no formal claim. The man who had once insisted on ownership did not reappear with proof. The volunteer organizations that had kept an eye on Milo concluded that his best path forward was a planned adoption route. There is always a moment in a rescue when the scales tip toward permanence or toward another temporary arrangement. The woman sat with paperwork and a sinking sense of what giving him up might mean. She imagined mornings without Milo's head on her lap and nights where a soft thud of pacing would not be a reality. She imagined his tail wag during the quiet hours and felt an odd grief at the thought of it gone. On a rainy Tuesday, after a morning at work where emails blurred together and the city felt like a fragile machine, she made a decision that had been growing with every small shared ritual. She walked into the volunteer's small office with a folder of forms and a hand that did not tremble as much as she expected. "I want to adopt him," she said. The volunteer smiled in the way people do when something both practical and tender happens at once. There were forms to sign, a small adoption fee paid largely by the donor who had helped with the exam, and a short chat about what adoption meant. Continued vet follow-ups, a commitment to care, and the knowledge that love is the scaffolding on which behavior is rebuilt. The process was not an erasure of the past, but an agreement to carry the future. The day was ordinary in weather and extraordinary in consequence. Milo, newly licensed and with a collar that bore his name, sat in the passenger seat and watched the city with an attentiveness that belonged to him alone. He stuck his head out the window when the light changed and savored a wind that smelled of rain on hot pavement. At a crosswalk, he looked up at her with the same patient eyes that had once asked for a crumb on the curb. She reached over and touched his ear. Simple, human, habitual. People still glanced, still filmed sometimes, but the glance now landed differently. Where once a crowd framed him as a prop in someone else's day, he had a human beside him who met the world like a partner. The vendor from the plaza waved and mouthed, "Good job," a shorthand recognition of small mercy made visible. Months later, Milo's coat shone with a dull pride, his ribs resilient under healthier flesh. He had favorite corners of the apartment, a sunlit spot on the windowsill, a little island of toys he guarded like treasures. He liked the bus ride less than the woman did, but he tolerated it, curling into her lap with a trust that no legal form could fully prescribe. Sometimes, on slow evenings, they would walk back to the plaza. The square had the same bright current of visitors. The accordion still wheezed its two chords. People moved as before, but now a small brown dog walked beside a woman who had decided not to look away. A child stopped to pat Milo and then, seeing him attentive and calm, laughed and ran along. A tourist photographed the fountain and then turned his lens to Milo. But this time the picture framed a life already altered. Not every rescue ends with a perfectly smooth arc. There were vet bills that stretched budgets, a bout of gastrointestinal distress that required extra attention, and moments when a neighbor's impatience felt like a slap. But the pattern was now ordinary. Small troubles met with small solutions, a community that had learned to extend a hand, and the slow, steady accretion of trust between two beings. On the anniversary of the Plaza Day, the woman returned alone at first, then sat on the low stone wall as a busker played a two-chord tune. Milo lay at her feet, head on paws, content. She watched the current of tourists move like a tide, some stopping, many flowing past. She thought about how easy it is to glide right by suffering, how tempting it is to file everything that requires effort into a folder called someone else's problem. A boy approached, tentative, with a question on the shape of a hand. "Why did you stop for him?" he asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. She looked at Milo, who cocked his head as if listening to the way the future sounds when it is being described. Then she looked at the boy. "Because I could," she said simply. "Because sometimes a life only needs one person to notice." The boy considered this, then crouched and ran a hand down Milo's spine. The dog leaned into the touch like a practiced answer. The plaza hummed on. The vendor sold his wares. The officer sat with a clipboard and a better story. People took pictures. But this time there was an afterimage that did not fade. A brown dog with a city-shaped past and a human who had translated a glance into a lifetime. If you watched Milo's small arc and felt something stir, there are ways to help beyond sharing a story. Volunteer at a local shelter, donate to organizations doing frontline work, foster animals when you can, and, most importantly, notice. All of those actions, like small coins in a jar, add up. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to see what a single, steady moment of attention can do. And if you're able, check the description for resources on how to help local rescues and shelters. A life changes in small increments, but sometimes all it takes is one person to stop, lock eyes, and decide to change a fate.